So we are at the end of the 5th chapter of the Gita. And Krishna just explained what he just explained that you Sparsham Kritva Bahi Bahyani, that you keep all external things like sense interactions outside of yourself. Shakshush Shaiva Antare Bhuho. And you focus your eyes inwards on your brow. Focus your eyes here. So focus upwards and inwards. So you're not looking externally. So you shut out external stimuli. Keep your gaze inwards. Pranapana samam kriva. You make your breath equal. Your ingoing and your outgoing breath equal. And then nasa abhyantara chayana. You make your breath moving with your nostrils equal. Yatindriya mano buddhi muni moksha parayana. Sage aiming at liberation controls his senses, mind, and intelligence. Vigata icha bhaya krodha. And you let go and you're finished with anger, fear, and desire. Yasada mukta evasa. The person who does that person is liberated. That's a pretty generic, pretty standard verse on what a traditional yoga practice might look like. In the early Upanishadic literature, yoga is about controlling the mind. It's about sitting with the head, back, and neck in a straight line. It's about controlling the breathing and focusing inwards. And so what you see here in the Gita is a real classical description of yoga. It lacks the seating with the head, neck, and back in a straight line, but anyway, that comes up in the next chapter, but the other elements are common. And so that, it wraps up. This whole chapter, we've been discussing knowledge and the powerful sun-like nature of knowledge and how it illuminates everything, including yourself, reveals everything. Earlier on in the chapter, we're still talking about knowledge, that when comparing yoga and sannyas, that the critical feature of sannyas was the detachment, the knowledge of detachment and ensuing detachment that was there. And that it's the yogi who participated in this world, who acted in this world. It's a different definition of a yogi than you would get normally. Normally when people think of a yogi, they think of a renunciate. But in this case, in Sanskrit, at this time period, that's not what a yogi was. A yogi was someone who participated in a battle, who participated in life. And if that yogi was detached, then that was non-different than being a sannyasi. That's what you're at the beginning of the chapter. That's a piece of knowledge. Or that knowledge of the nature, ephemeral nature of the world that led you to live in this world but not be of it, that knowledge was important. And that turned into a glorification. Knowledge as being what was innate to the soul and which enabled the soul to conquer over the darkness of ignorance with the sun of knowledge that was innate. And then we got a description of what that looks like. That helps you to view people up and down on the food chain, up and down in your life, big and small, to view them all equally. Even to see the soul in animals as well. And that knowledge led you to an antarsukha, an internal happiness. Led you to an antarsukha, an internal happiness, and an antarjyoti, internal light, inner light. And it led you to touch Brahman, find an everlasting happiness. So if you look at this chapter, this is what's going on. There's knowledge is on the forefront. It's the theme of the chapter. Arguably, you could say knowledge is the theme of every chapter. There's a piece of knowledge in every chapter, or several, that Krishna is trying to enlighten us with. The Gita is a book of knowledge. It's a book of questions and answers. But this chapter specifically uses the word jnana regularly, speaks about knowledge as being sun-like, speaks about the results of that knowledge. The verses are both prescriptive, they tell you how to behave and live. They have cognitive and behavioral components to them. They have to think, and they tell you how to live. But then they're also descriptive, in that they tell you what you should look for in yourself if you're making spiritual advancement. So, although knowledge is arguably the central feature of the entire Gita, because at all times Krishna is attempting to teach something. Even when he's not teaching Arjuna at the beginning of the Gita, and he denies an instruction, he's still ultimately trying to teach him to come at him correctly, so that there can be a proper transmission of knowledge. So you could argue at every step of the Gita, from its very first verse, where we're being told that we're on the field of Dharma, Dharma che tre, on the field of Dharma, Kuru che tre, on the field of the Kurus. Then they gather together to fight. So from the very first word of the Gita, it's Dharma, and we're being enlightened as a blind king. He doesn't know what's going on, and he's being told what's going on by his minister, who can remotely view the battle. But that being established, notwithstanding that, this chapter speaks about knowledge and describes, for the bulk of the chapter, the effects of knowledge, the ramifications of knowledge, and it uses that word over and over again. The fourth chapter tells us by the boat of knowledge, jnana plavena, by the boat of knowledge, by jnana plava, you cross over the ocean of meshes. That knowledge can purify the greatest papkrit dhamma, the greatest doer of sin. Knowledge can purify that person. Sukham atmani vindati, it helps you find happiness within yourself. So the fourth chapter also actually has some verses which are very similar to what we find in this chapter, but there's more of the same. It's the end of the fourth chapter. And the Gita originally was not divided into chapters. That happened later on in a commentatorial tradition. chapters came later. And so at the end of the 4th through the 5th chapter, you find knowledge showing up as the centerpiece. It starts actually at the end of the 4th chapter and rolls its way through the entirety of the 5th chapter. And I've tried to demonstrate that just now. And then we find this quizzical verse at the end of the chapter, which has been, like I said, fairly generic. Has been a generic description of yoga, some ideas about the nature of transcendental knowledge, egalitarianism, some troubleshooting of yoga versus sannyas, activity versus renunciation. And then we find this verse. A person with full consciousness of me, knowing me as the ultimate beneficiary of all sacrifices and austerities, knowing me as the supreme Lord of all planets and demigods, and knowing me as the benefactor and well-wisher of the living entities, that person attains peace from the pangs of material existence. The literal verse says, Yatva ma, having known me. Yatva comes from gyat, just like the word gyan comes from gyat. It's where you get the word gnosis from in English, which means knowledge, an old word for knowledge. It's where you get the word agnostic from. Agya, you don't know. So gyatva ma, having known me. Having known me. Should be having known me, yatva ma, shanti richati. He achieves peace. Having known me, he achieves peace. How does he know me? Bhoktaram yagya tapasam. He knows me as the enjoyer of yagya and tapas. He knows me as the enjoyer of yagna, sacrifice, the Vedic ritual sacrifice, which was introduced in the 3rd chapter, and tapas, austerity, various religious observances where you give up this or that in order to turn yourself away from externals towards the internals, the things you let go of so you can focus inward and not external. Bhoktaram yagya tapasam, the enjoyer of yagna and tapas. Sarva loka maheshwara. Ishwar means Lord, from Ish, which means to control. So Ishwar, Maheshwar means great control, like Mahaprasad, Maheshwar. It's generally a name of Shiva. Maheshwar. Of course, if you read like the Vishnu Sahasranam, you'll find that Maheshwar is a name ultimately of Vishnu. So it's not like we give that name up to Shiva. But if you said, if somebody's like, what's your name in India? You say, oh, my name is Maheshwar. If somebody, Raviji, if somebody said to you, you said to someone, what is your name, sir? And he said, oh, my name is Maheshwar. Right? What do you understand that name? His name was like Maheshwar Sharma or something like this. What do you understand of that name, Maheshwar?
It's commonly like Shiva reference to the Shiva.
Right? Common.
Yeah.
Although the word Maheshwar literally means great control, somehow in India that name has become synonymous with Shiva. Allah means the great one, but somehow that name has become synonymous with the God of the Muslims. It's just that they use that word a lot. I mean, I'm unaware of Allah being used in other places. I don't know if Allah existed pre-Islamic Middle East as a designation for the monotheistic deity. I'm not sure. You've got Yahweh, Elohim. You know what I mean? You have words in Hebrew that were used. I'm not sure. I mean, obviously Allah is Arabic. I never looked at the etymology of the term, but somewhat similar to how, I mean, that may not be a perfect example, because ostensibly Allah was not used by the Jews and Christians, who were the other religions of that time in Islam. It wasn't used at that time. And so then Muhammad was really introducing like a newer term. I doubt that it was completely new. There must have been some history of the term. I don't know if he coined it. I'll definitely look it up later. But don't, you guys, let's focus on class. Don't you guys try and like, or maybe you guys have each want to be my teacher or something like that, but it's cool. I can figure it out on my own. So don't just like stop what you're doing and spend the rest of class researching it so you can like show you're cool. Just chill and focus. I'll do it on my own dime. That may not be perfect because that name is so associated with Islam and no other tradition. But yeah, you know, like Yahweh is an old Hebrew name, but it became like Jehovah, and that became associated with Jehovah Witnesses. That's their pronunciation. Again, it's not a perfect example because, again, almost nobody says Jehovah except for the Jehovah Witnesses. It's kind of their mispronunciation of what's most probably Yahweh. But sometimes there's a word for something, and you know, it just gets co-opted by a group. It kind of becomes theirs. There's a whole thing with copyright, intellectual property laws, with trademarks. Have you guys ever heard of Jell-O, brand gelatin? Like, what a dumb thing to say. Jell-O, brand gelatin, and make some fun. So it's a commercial. Get Jell-O, brand gelatin, and make some fun. For a little gelatin, it's a super like unattractive word. Jell-O has all the goodness of gelatin with none of the lameness of it. Then gelatin, of course, comes from like the hooves of animals. And it's like a product of rendering. When they kill an animal for meat, then they do all sorts of nasty stuff with every bit of the animal they can muster, so the bones get used to make bone char, which is used to polish sugar and make it white, which is why a lot of vegans are not into white sugar. One reason. One way around that's to buy organic sugar, because they never clarify natural or organic sugar, even white organic sugar, with bone char. But otherwise, you know, a lot of the white sugar in the world is processed and clarified with bone char, polished with bone char to make it white. It's a real nasty, like old school way of making it. Beet sugar, if you get your sugar from Idaho or something like that, then you're good to go. Like my bakery that makes bread for my restaurant, I can't control what kind of sugar they use, but I went ahead and got a hold of the company, found out what kind of sugar they used, and thank God it was like an Idaho company, because I knew the answer. Then I called the chief chemist of the company, and we had a discussion. He goes, "Hey, we're in Idaho. This is beet sugar." He's like, "We don't use bone char." You know that. And I was like, "Yeah, of course not. For beet sugar, they don't use it. For cane sugar, they have to use it. Somehow the processing of cane sugar has more natural molasses occurring in the sugar, and so requires it to be clarified more. And so a lot of the sugar manufacturers, like C&H, they use bone char. Anyway, the process called rendering. It's when you take the carcass of an animal and you try to make use of whatever. So you're rennet from the stomach lining. That's where traditional rennet and cheese making would come from. You're making the hooves and other parts of the animal into gelatin. The bones are getting used for bone char. And it's just real nasty, you know. And you can go to the store and buy like cow tongue and all sorts of like the organs. People are really into it, you know, making bone broth. If you look at like traditional soul food, really the cuisine of the slaves and the antebellum South, and even after the emancipation of the South, when you look at the culture of the poor black people who reside in that area, and you look at the soul food, you see a lot of like chicken necks and like, you know, just like, you know, different stuff that like you would never think was meant to be food. It's because those parts of the animal were still available and they were cheaper and easier to come by. And so they made a cuisine which was, you know, using what was available, collard greens, you know, mustard greens, things which were not considered to be so desirable, almost like leftovers of the process of agriculture. And they made a cuisine out of it. You go to Bengal, the place where our tradition comes from, and you find that, you know, like they eat every single type of green. Like you'll get like 3 or 4 spinach-esque preparations in a meal. You know, you get at least a couple of shocks in a meal. Shock being the name for the spinach substances, but it's never just like straight spinach. They also eat that, which is palak in North India. But they're eating like you will go through the, you know, you go through and they're like, oh yeah, like, you know, like, oh, you know, there's some vegetable, but then they eat the greens off that vegetable, always. And they you know, everything there that's growing in the field, they're using those greens, and normally you wouldn't think of those things. They would just be thrown away. You know, like carrot tops or something like that. But they figure out a way to make it into something like a subji that you can eat. So yeah, so rendering. So why would Jello get, I mean, I guess I'm teaching you guys a little something about intellectual property laws, but why would they sing this dumb song? Get Jello, brand gelatin, and make some fun. Do they still sing that song? Is it still in commercials? It was when I was a kid. I guarantee it still is. And if you look at a box of Jello brand gelatin, it says Jello brand gelatin. Do you know why it says Jello brand gelatin? You do? Mm-hmm. Tell me.
Because if Jello becomes the common word for gelatin, then they don't have intellectual property rights to the word Jello anymore.
That's correct. I just realized. I just realized. I didn't know who you were, Nick. Like, who's that Ruko kid? How come he's not wearing Tulsi beads? I wasn't ending him, but he's got a Sika and he's trying to figure it out. I couldn't tell from here. I'm just like, oh, this is crazy. So I couldn't tell. And so then you start talking and I realized, oh, it's Nick with his haircut. That's right. Perfect. You've understood, yeah. If Jello got really popular and then the word Jello started getting used by people to refer to any flavored gelatin. The moment that they become so popular that they corner the market and all gelatin is known as Jello, and all tissues are known as Kleenexes, and all copies are known as Xeroxes, when a company becomes that successful, you follow? And all pictures are called Polaroids. Kodak, Polaroid, did they coin that? They coined that, I think Kodak coined Polaroid. So, as soon as that happens, you lose your intellectual property rights. You lose your trademark. You lose your ability to say that's our unique mark that designates us, and you can't use it to designate your products. You follow? The moment that happens, you lose your trademark because you were so popular that every tissue became called a Kleenex. Every copy made with a copy machine was called a Xerox. And every flavored gelatin on the market was called Jello. Once that can be established, you were so successful at marketing, you became such a monopoly that you lose your right to call that your individual mark and deny other people from using it. And so when a company like Jello began to lose their trademark, for Jello. Then they called it Jello brand gelatin. And they made sure to advertise it all over the world and all of their marketing. It's weird and it's like unnecessary, and if redundant as it is, it was required to protect their trademark status, so Jello belonged to them and nobody else. Now, it's not their fault if they're just so cool. Everybody wants to call their stuff Jello, but they got to make it like as difficult as possible. So nowadays, every type of flavored gelatin is known as Jello. Like we'll go to the store and get some vegan Jello. That's like, it's not Jello brand vegan Jello. It's just whatever 365 brand or whatever, wherever we're buying it. But maybe from Agar Agar or something like that. But they still call it Jello because they were so successful. And copies are also still called Xeroxes. Tissues are still called Kleenexes. But those companies made a significant good faith effort in their marketing to give themselves a unique moniker, and that allowed them to protect their trademark. So, Maheshwar somehow has become associated with Shiva, although the term is not innately linked to Shiva, but they rolled with it enough, they made a big enough deal about it that it became their term. Sarvaloka Maheshwara, the great Lord of all the worlds. So it's like a step up. You're not just Maheshwar, you're Sarvalok Maheshwar, the great Lord of all the worlds. So if you know me, having known me, Yavamam, Shantim Richati, you attain peace. Having known me as what? As Bhoktaram Yajya Tapasam, as the enjoyer of all yagna and tapas, as Sarvaloka Maheshwaram, as the great Lord of all the worlds. I can just say this. If somebody says Maheshwar, then you think, oh, that's Shiva. If somebody says Sarvalok Maheshwar, what's your name? Sarvalok Maheshwar. Now it's like, oh, then you're Vishnu. Because somehow by adding those adjectival modifiers to Maheshwar, now you become Vishnu again. Because only Vishnu would be the Sarvalok Maheshwar, the great Lord of all worlds, as opposed to just the great Lord. Does that make sense? Yeah, so when I thought of Allah, like that term never got broadened in its usage. You know? It was so specific from the get-go, and it still is real specific. And then Jehovah also was like real specific, and it's still specific. But we're talking about a term which was really generic, and then it got owned by people. So I gave an example of the opposite, which was a term which was specific, which became general, and then they tried to make it specific again. But we'd have to find a word in the English language that was really generic in its original usage, but then eventually became identified primarily with one thing. You follow? And I'm at a loss, and I'm not going to waste any more time. So I kind of talked around it with intellectual property. You got a solution to my problem?
Not a solution. It's just Christian Arab speakers call their God Allah as well.
Christian Arab speakers. Christian Arabic speakers.
Arabic speakers, yeah. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, okay, good. So I don't know what to do with that because it still doesn't answer my question either.
But
and that could be, it could either be because, oh right, it did get broadened. It did get broadened. Yeah, that's good. Of course, I was trying to look for something which started broad and got specific. You gave me an example of something which was questionable whether it was broad or specific, but then which became broad over time. Yeah, I don't know what to do with it. You're right. It is a fun fact though. It is a fun fact. All right. So then, and then Suhridham Sarvabhutanam. Suhrit means well-wisher. Hrit means heart. So Suhrit means somebody who's dear to your heart. Suhridam Sarvabhutanam. For all people. Sarvalok, all worlds. Sarvabhuta, all beings. Bhu means be. Bhuta means being. Like a being. Like a creature. something created, like a being, something which has beingness as its salient feature. Suhridam sarvabhutanam, the well-wishing friend of all living entities. So Sarvalok Maheshwara, the great Lord of all the worlds. So Sarvalok and Sarvabhuta, all living beings, all worlds. You're the Lord of all the worlds, and you're the friend of all beings. If you know me, Yatvam, if you know me like that, Shantim Richati, then you attain peace. This verse, to some extent, is a little bit quizzical in that it just appears at the end of the chapter. We had a flow. And then this verse gets thrown in the mix. Why is this verse here? How does this verse fit in with the rest of the chapter is my question. You want to answer me? Loudly?
Well, you had mentioned that before the Gita wasn't broken into chapters. So I wanted to, you said, how does it get brought
Well, how does this verse follow after the preceding verses also? Or the next chapter gets back into the yoga. So this verse dips out of the yoga conversation about, pranayama and breathing and living in the forest and stuff like that. It dips out of that conversation, which we're just beginning now. And it sticks out like a sore thumb. And then we go back to that conversation. So irrespective of what you want to do with the chapters and how they're divided, the verse still sticks out like a sore thumb. If you take away the chapter divisions, then it's even worse. Because you're talking about a classical, discussion of yoga with pranayama and closing your eyes. You go back to that discussion, and then this verse is just stuck in the middle. So it actually becomes even more quizzical if you take away the chapter divisions. As opposed to where I was trying to demonstrate some congruence between the end of the 4th chapter and the beginning of the 5th chapter by getting rid of the chapter difference, the chapter divisions. I was trying to demonstrate why there was some congruence between the end of the 4th and the 5th chapter. This actually sticks out and becomes more of a question mark when you get rid of the chapter divisions. Did you follow that?
Yeah, I did, but if I'm remembering correctly, in the 4th chapter, like near the end of the 4th chapter, Yajna was brought up a lot in
Yajna was brought up in the middle of the 4th chapter and the 3rd chapter. Okay?
And
So now we've skipped that for an entire chapter, and now we're back to it. I'm not saying the words in this chapter have never been introduced anywhere in the Gita, and that every single Sanskrit word here is unique and is being introduced for the first time. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the concept here. What's the concept of this verse? I doubt you guys understand the verse, although I've laboriously and like exactly explained what the verse is teaching us. Are you with us, Darshan? Are you, Darshan works, but also today, are you with us?
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay. Have you been following closely what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay. What is the basic thrust of the verse?
In the entire chapter, the theme has been knowledge, and knowledge has been used to describe various different kinds of benefits one could attain having such knowledge.
Okay.
This verse now switches where the knowledge becomes knowledge of Krishna specifically.
Yes. Good. So there's a couple things I'm going to comment on what you said. Number one, we go from a generic understanding of knowledge and the spiritual benefits of said knowledge to a very devotional, monotheistic conception of what it means to be Gnostic or a knower. Namely, to know him is to love him. And now knowledge is now knowledge of God. In that sense, there's a dramatic change. At the same time, Tadeo, and the rest of you, I try to show you guys something of the thread that ties everything together. Are you interrupting me now?
No.
I'm telling. So you need to raise your hand. Zip
Right.
it. Well, you just did, so don't.
I won't make it worse.
Yeah, when I'm talking, when your teacher talks, you should shut up. And that desire to speak over me is an indication that you're not my student. If you have that desire to interrupt me and speak, that means you're not my student. You just have that desire. You're like a 2-year-old raising your hand, asking for a cookie. It was clear. You're all excited to cut me off and speak over me. It's okay. I can live with it. It's cool. But it certainly is not something that a student does to a teacher. Back to what we're talking about. This idea of knowledge, I seeded, like putting seeds in the ground. I seeded it. I also steeped-headed it by establishing it as foundational. So you can take either way of understanding of the very similar statement. I either seeded it or seated it. Either one amounts to the same. Into the class so that you would see the thread of continuity. That knowledge is being discussed, and here, knowledge is also being discussed. That would appear to be an answer to my question. At least prima facie would appear to be. Well, the chapter was about knowledge, and now at the end we're getting knowledge of Krishna. However, you've correctly observed, Hideo, that despite that answer being the obvious answer you're going to go to as kind of step one, that we've really moved from a generic understanding of knowledge to a real specific devotional, monotheistic understanding of knowledge as pertaining to God. And so that still leaves the question as yet unanswered. Right, Tadeo? You want to comment further?
No problem.
Okay. You got something to say?
I want to say
Loudly?
Yes, there's another thread in this where he's saying that he's the ultimate beneficiary of sacrifices and austerities. And that goes right back to the beginning of the chapter where Krishna makes the move from yoga to Sankhya. So he's talking about what work is for and what it's all about. And he's like, okay, Sankhya is the same thing. It is about knowledge. But then here he ties that, he puts a bow on it. And he says that he is the goal of work as well.
I'm unclear. The goal of work?
Or like, work should be to satisfy him. Like that same theistic move he makes with knowledge, he does with work.
Yeah, okay. That's nice. I would go in a little different direction than you did. I don't know if I'm going to repeat what you said, because I think people aren't going to be able to follow it. Anyway, I'm going to do it. There's a theistic move from knowledge to knowledge of God. Similarly, there's a theistic move from work in yoga to working for God, because he's the beneficiary of your work. You could also say that yajna is an act and tapas is a renunciation. Tapas is giving something up. Yajna is doing something. So in a lot of ways, yajna and tapas are like yama and niyama. They're like positive and negative descriptions. What do you do and what do you not do? What are the rules and the regulations? What do you do and what do you not do? Yajna is something you do. Tapas is something you don't do. You give up. You abstain from it. And so to say I'm the enjoyer of both positive and negative things could also be understood to be I'm the enjoyer of both Sankhya and yoga, or sannyas and yoga. When you're trying to give things up and renounce things, or whether you're doing things, either way I'm the enjoyer of both of them. So you could do yajna and tapas and understand those both to be positive behavioral things. And therefore there's an idea that work is also for God. You could also look at yajna and tapas as being both cognitive and behavioral, or rather positive and negative behaviors. And he's the enjoyer of both of those. In which case the tapas becomes more akin to the knowledge and the detachment and the renunciation. And so that first quatrain, the first quarter of the verse, by itself becomes a complete statement, instead of the first quarter of the verse being just the via positiva and the behavioral component. Now it becomes both. Did you follow that? Did you guys follow that? You follow that? Did you follow that? Oh, that's what it is. Did you follow that today? Good. It still doesn't tell us why we made the move from a generic understanding to a theistic understanding. And that deserves a little bit of attention. I think the reason is because we're always making that move in the Gita. And actually, this has been happening every chapter. Krishna said, Yukta asita matpadaha. Yukta, yoga, sitting, asita, so asana is a verb. He sits yoga, matpadaha, with me as the highest object. That's in the second chapter. Krishna says that you sit in yoga with him as the highest object. Sarva karmani, adhyatma cheta sarva karmani, mayi sanyasya sarva karmani, mat cheta, mayi sarvasya, let's see, mayi sarvani karmani, adhyatma chetasa. Renounce everything to me in spiritual consciousness. That's in the third chapter. That's in the third chapter. Janma karma chamedivyam evam yovita tatva deham punar janma naiti mamati sojna. Tatva deham punar janma naiti mamati so arjuna. Janma karma chamedivyam evam yoveti tatvata. One who knows that I am transcendental does not take birth again. You find that in the fourth chapter. So actually, in every chapter of the Gita, from its inception, we find quizzical, red herring-like verses that don't fit where Krishna springboards us into full-blown theism. In the fourth chapter, of course, Krishna describes himself as God. That I descend in this world to protect the devotees, remove the miscreants. And so Krishna identifies himself as God, or Chaturvanya Maya Shrishtam. I created the different social classes. Krishna himself was, I created the universe. I spoke to the sun god, the dawn of creation. And so Krishna identifies himself so many ways as God in the fourth chapter. It's kind of out of nowhere. So although this appears to be a red herring, Krishna's just building up momentum to doing full-blown theology, and these types of verses come up in every chapter. And they just get more explicit as the Gita goes on. We're talking about knowledge, that ultimately leads you to knowledge of God. These types of verses are always there. You follow? And so to really, Brahman got introduced. And so now Krishna is the source of Brahman. And so naturally it's going to lead you to a discussion of Krishna. If you know Brahman, you're actually going to know Krishna, because he's the source of Brahman. It says moksha parayana, dedicated to liberation. Well, this verse defines what that means to be dedicated to liberation. You're dedicated to Krishna. The last verse finished off with the words moksha parayana. They're dedicated to liberation. And so this is what that means. So this verse follows on the heels of the previous verse. What you think of when you close your eyes. What you think of. A lot of people are, people say I meditate. My next natural question is, what do you meditate on? And they're usually like, I just breathe and quiet my mind. Okay, so you don't really meditate per se, you just breathe and quiet your mind. Meditation for me means you meditate on something. You have some positive content. Otherwise you're just quieting your mind. And obviously the word meditate, can mean whatever people want it to mean. It's generic enough. The Sanskrit word for meditate, dhyana, smarana, remembrance, or dhyan, visualization, japa, the recitation of sounds, sacred sounds. These are the traditional types of meditation mentioned in our scriptures, and they all have some positive content. And so now you close your eyes, you shut out external things, you're looking in your heart. What do you find? Oh, Krishna's there in your heart. You're aiming towards liberation. So what are you aiming towards? You're aiming towards Krishna. Why? Because Krishna said, mat padaha, mat parayana. Mat parayana means dedicated to me. Mat padaha means focused on me. It's the same word. With me as the highest object. Parayana is from para. It's like the Greek word meta, like metaphysics, or metanoia, afterthought. It's like what goes beyond the regular thing. So para means the same thing in Sanskrit. So mat parayana, with me as the highest object. Mat padaha, dedicated to me as the highest object. They mean the same thing. So previously Krishna said, doing your yoga with me as the highest object, that was in the second chapter. And now you're moksha parayana, you're dedicated to liberation. But now Krishna's telling you what that means to be dedicated to liberation. So we could look at the immediate context, and Krishna's filling in the blank. We can look at the larger structure of the Gita, and these red herrings are all over the place, and they're just going to get more and more commonplace until they become the actual main subject of every chapter. Additionally, we've been talking about knowledge, so Krishna's got to bring it to knowledge of himself. Veti, he knows. Veti, evam yo veti tatvata, one who knows me in truth, that I'm transcendental. So here, veti, from vit, to know, we get the word video from. And so here, jatvamam, having known me. It's the same idea. And so actually, although this seems like it sticks out, we have similar construed verses in every single chapter. Because ultimately, Krishna's trying to teach us to be bhaktas. And this is perhaps the most explicit verse on bhakti thus far. There's a verse where Krishna said, because you're my sakha, my bhakta, because you're my friend and my devotee, I'll tell you this knowledge. So actually the word bhakta has already come up, but in a very generic sense. In a very generic sense. The root of bhakti, yeyatam prapajante tangstajaiva bhajami, I share, I reciprocate with you. It's from Bhaj, it's in the 4th chapter. That's the root of the word bhakti. The root bhaj, to share. So as much as you approach me, that much I share with you. So the root of the word bhakti, and actually the word bhakta are already introduced in the 4th chapter. But they're not introduced in a way which is really bhakti proper. And here we find this verse is perhaps the most bhakti-esque verse that you're going to find in Gita. But the 6th chapter finishes the same way. The 7th chapter finishes the same way. The 8th chapter finishes the same way. The 9th chapter finishes the same way. The 10th chapter and 11th chapter and 12th chapter all finish the same way. The 13th chapter actually is kind of together with the 14th chapter, and the 14th chapter finishes in the same way. The 15th chapter finishes in the same way. The 18th chapter finishes in the same way. The 16th and 17th chapters kind of half finish in this way if you've got the ability to see it. But every chapter finishes like this. Because Krishna's building up steam. So every chapter from here on out has more and more of these verses as its highlight reel, as its ultimate conclusion. Knowledge leads to knowledge of God, who's the source of everything. Being dedicated to liberation, ultimately being dedicated to Krishna, who's the source of everything. giving something up or doing something, which is really one way to look at sannyasa and yoga from this chapter, either one of those, via positiva or via negativa, they both relate to Krishna. You get Krishna's power, I'm the great Lord of all the worlds, and you get Krishna's sweetness, I'm the best friend of all people. It's apropos that in the first day of the holy month of Kartik, where we celebrate Krishna's sweet nature, we find this verse. You could actually spend the rest of your life looking at this verse, fleshing out the implication of what it means to accept Krishna as your best friend. I consider Krishna's name to be my best friend. Krishna's name has been with me since I was a child. I chant japa, and as such, Krishna's name is always just part of my daily fare. It's my most consistent relationship. It's a relationship I've been investing in daily since I was 16 years old. I'm 48. So 32, 2/3 of my life I've been chanting japa. My job was my friend. It's Krishna stowing away, like in my heart, staying with me, no matter what I go through. My beads are so important to me too, because my beads are this element of my japa. I chant on beads, and my beads are so important to me also. So, Krishna's my best friend, for sure. The deities are my best friend, for sure. The holy name is my best friend, for sure. Krishna, as he is revealed concretely in the words of our scripture, is my best friend. Krishna is the words of our scripture, because in those words you'll find God. Krishna is the holy name, because in that name you'll find God. Krishna is the deity. In some ways more directly, but not really. It's actually, I mean the same thing. The scriptures, the sacred sound of our tradition, actually is God incarnating in this world in a form I can touch with my voice and my ears. Krishna incarnating in this world as his holy name is a form I can touch with my voice and my ears. And Krishna incarnating as deity is in a form I can touch with my hands. The name of Krishna is an avatar. Kali Kali Namarupe Krishna avatar. Kali Kali, in the time of Kali, Namarupe, in the form of the name, Krishna avatar, Krishna descends. Just as Krishna sets and leaves this world, this Bhagavad Puranarka, it's like the sun, it arises. The sun of Krishna sets, then the sun of the Bhagavatam arises, so that Krishna is still available to you. He never left, because he's there in the words of the Bhagavatam. The words are reminiscent of Krishna, but they're also a portal. They are Krishna. You will find Krishna in the words of our scriptures. You will read the scriptures and be transported to the spiritual world and have a divine experience of Krishna. You'll chant japa, you'll have a divine experience of Krishna. You'll touch the deity, have a divine experience of Krishna, and realize, oh my God, Krishna magically, mystically, omnipotently descended into this world in a form I could interact with, so he was never away from me. That's what it means to be someone's best friend. You never leave him. Krishna's everybody's best friend, and he's my best friend. That subjective experience of Krishna being your best friend is the cornerstone of bhakti. The philosophy, the dispassionate, objective philosophy of it, is that he's the best friend of all living entities. The experience of the devotee is extremely subjective. Krishna is my best friend. when the cowherd boy sat with Krishna, he ate with all of them, and magically, by his omnipotence, he sat in front of each one of them. So each one of them, out of thousands and millions of cowherd boys, got to eat with Krishna personally. Each gopi got to dance with Krishna personally. But they did not experience that. They experienced Krishna was dancing with me. Krishna was eating with me. That's what they experienced. The subjective experience of God's personal love for us is the cornerstone of bhakti. It's built on a backdrop of objective, omnipotent, omnibenevolent truth. But the experience of it is always subjective. Just like consciousness is always experienced in the first person, Krishna's love is always experienced in the first person. Because you are loved by Krishna, because you feel Krishna's love, you can recognize when Krishna's loving somebody else, the same way you can recognize somebody else's conscious, based on your own experience of consciousness. There's a phenomenological, to use the correct term, inherently subjective experience of Krishna being a well-wishing friend of all living entities, which is Krishna's your best friend. Krishna never left you. Krishna's always got your back. Krishna's always helping you. Krishna never forsook you. You forsook Krishna. He never forsook you. It's fitting that this verse showed up on the first day of Kartik for us, because it allows us to, when we celebrate this, we say, Iti drik swalila bhi ananda kunde swagosham nimajanta akyapayanta. To demonstrate or to declare, you demonstrate or you declare by these pastimes that immerse and drown your family members in pools of ecstasy. What do you demonstrate? What do you declare? Tadiya ishita gyeshu. To those who are absorbed in knowledge of your opulences. To those who are immersed in knowledge of your opulence. Ishita, ish. Gyeshu, ya. Same words. Sarvaloka Maheshwar, Ishwar, Ishita Gyeshu. To those who are immersed in knowledge of your power. Bhaktir Jitatvam. You're announcing them. What are you announcing to those people who are thinking about your power? Bhaktai Jitatva. That you are conquered by bhakti. Bhaktai, by bhakti, Jitatva. You have the quality of being conquered by bhakti. You're announcing to the world that's filled with an idea of your greatness, your power, that you're conquered by bhakti. Sarva Lokamaheshwaram, Suhridam Sarvabhutanam. The great Lord of all the worlds, the best friend of each soul. And what that really boils down to is Krishna's your best friend. Krishna's there for you. Krishna's helping you. Krishna won't give up on you. We experience this primarily in the first instance in the love of our Guru Jana, in the love of the Vaishnavas. They don't forsake us. They see the good in us. They bring out the good in us. They represent Krishna's love in this world, unconditionally, seeing the best in us, bringing out the best in us, drawing out the best in us, taking gold from a dirty place, bringing out our best. The Vaishnavas do this. And then they teach us how to experience that same thing directly from Krishna. We get it from the Vaishnavas.